Hello. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name's Rachel South, and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House, and I'm so pleased to welcome Howard Amos and Tom Parfitt for tonight's discussion about Howard's book, Russia Starts Here, Real Lives in the Ruins of Empire, which has been shortlisted for this year's Pushkin House Book Prize. I'll just say a few words about Howard and Tom, and then we can get started. Howard Amos is a writer and journalist whose work has been published in The Guardian, Newsweek, Foreign Policy, The Associated Press, and The New Republic. Howard spent a year living in Pskov Region in the far west of Russia before working for almost a decade as a correspondent in Moscow. He left Russia in the days after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and for a year he was editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times in exile whilst he was based in Armenia. Russia Starts Here, which has been shortlisted for the Pushkin House Book Prize, is Howard's first book. It gives a nuanced perspective of today's Russia through the people and histories of Pskov Region, drawing on hundreds of Howard's interviews and his visits to the region over a period of 15 years. Tom Parfitt lived and worked as a journalist in Russia for 20 years. He was a correspondent for The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, The Times, and frequently reported on Chechnya and the wider North Caucasus. And Tom is currently a doctoral researcher in creative writing at Bath Spa University. Last year, Tom was shortlisted for the Pushkin House Book Prize for his book, High Caucasus, A Mountain Quest in Russia's Haunted Hinterland, which tells the story of his 1,000-mile walk across 7 Russian republics and the Greater Caucasus Mountains from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. And it's great to see Tom back at the house for another year. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and we hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. So we're here to discuss Howard's wonderful new book, Russia Starts Here. Howard and I overlapped in Moscow as members of the press corps there for about a decade, I guess, even a bit more probably, Howard, didn't we? And I've always been a kind of huge admirer of his quietly brilliant work. And what can we say about the book? I feel like I'm kind of running out of superlatives for it, really. But it's just such an exquisitely observed book. It's full of pathos and humanity. But it's also full of very perceptive analysis. So if you haven't been lucky enough to read it yet, I really urge you to snaffle your copy tonight and get a dedication from Howard in it to add to the pleasure of having the beautiful object itself. So before we launch into your sort of personal story, Howard, maybe you could just give us a little introduction to Pskov Region. Could you, tell us where it is, what is its significance historically, and maybe a little bit of an idea of how that role has changed over time?
Hey, thanks very much, Tom, and great to see so many people here tonight. Pskov Region is in the far west of Russia. It borders Estonia, Latvia, and Belarus, so it has a border, one of Russia's few borders with the EU and NATO. It's 2/3 the size of Scotland, but for Scotland's 5.4 million people, it has 580,000 people. So it's relatively sparsely populated. It's sort of the capital, Pskov, is a 4 or 5 hour journey by car from St. Petersburg. And from Moscow, you normally get an overnight train. So it's a sort of Russian heartland region. It's a sort of Slavic heartland region. Historically, it was where one of the first places the Vikings came in the 9th century and sort of fused with the local Slav tribes to what would create what would be the Russian people. It for a long time. It was on the western edge of Russia. It was where a lot of diplomats and invading armies and departing armies would enter and leave Russia. It was in in the medieval period, it was a city republic. It sort of played off the rising power of Moscow to the east and the Latin principalities to the west. And then when the Russian Empire expanded, so Pskov was sort of subsumed into the expanding Muscovite state, and the Russian Empire moved westward. And for several centuries it was more a sort of backwater. But then with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it became again this frontier region.
And is it right to say in that medieval period that there was a sort of, quite a great intermingling of cultures, a sort of compromise, trade? There's even rather kind of democratic tradition there. It's a very sort of cosmopolitan European place, right?
Yes, I mean, you probably wouldn't want to go too far, but there is definitely this heritage, this legacy in Pskov of this medieval period when it was a city republic. For example, Pskov is the only Russian city where the city walls were built to encompass the entire city rather than just to protect everyone in the city rather than just the rich and powerful in the very center. There's something called the Pskov Judicial Charter, which much more, sort of looks much more towards Western legal traditions rather than Slavic legal traditions. It's very tight. It was always very tied into the West. The City Republic was part of the. It wasn't a full member, but it was part of the Hanseatic League, this sort of trading zone across the Baltic in the medieval period that stretched as far west as London. It's and its democratic tradition. So it was ruled. Well, the prince was selected by a sort of crude council. So it was a sort of crude form of democracy, and that is actually, I think, maybe one of the more hopeful bits of the book, that there is, when you think of Russia, you don't think of sort of democratic traditions, but if you're looking for a democratic tradition in Russia, Pskov or neighboring Novgorod is where you would go.
Fascinating. And so, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to go there, and what did you do once you arrived?
Yeah. I'll just flick to the next slide. There's a map of Pskov itself. So when I came to Pskov Region for the first time was in 2007, when I was a university student in the UK, and I was volunteering at a summer camp, which was run by a Russian charity, at a state-run orphanage near the town of Porkhov, which you can see there. So it's a state-run orphanage for mentally and physically disabled children. So that was the first time I went to Pskov Region. That's the village where the orphanage was. And it's the road where we'd walk up every day to sort of put on games and activities for the children in the orphanage. So that was the first time I'd been to Pskov Region, and that kind of became the reason why I kept going back there. And I volunteered again and again, and I lived there for the best part of a year after I finished university, volunteering and working for this charity. And then I moved to Moscow, became a journalist, but went back often.
I think you, at some point in the book, described that as being a sort of life-changing moment when you went there, you saw the orphanage, and you began working there. Can you just say a little bit about the conditions that you saw there, why it touched you, why it became important to you to keep going back? That's the shot from the orphanage, not my photo, but it was taken the first year I went there, 2007. When I first went there, I was, 20, 21. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd been to Moscow and St. Petersburg before, but living in rural Russia and spending time in this place was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And it made a deep impression. I think it made a deep impression on all the volunteers, Russian, most of whom were Russian, but some of whom were foreigners as well. If you a lot of the volunteers kept going back, set up charities. Some of them adopted children. Some of them became, speech therapists or teachers as a result of their experience. So it had a very, very powerful impact. It was seeing, deprived children
who had, as far as you could tell, they had a lot of potential, and it was sort of trapped in this system. Not that I would sort of subscribe to a sort of black and white view where everyone in the system was bad and all the volunteers were great. It very much wasn't like that, but it was sort of encountering this sort of close up, and it was lots of the volunteers. We were all, most of us were in our early 20s. And there were these 100-odd kids in this orphanage, and it was a very intense 4 weeks, and you spent a lot of time with each other, and sort of very intense bonds, and you felt like you got to know people. I'm still very good friends with some of the other volunteers, and yeah.
One of the things you talked about that you saw there was that quite a lot of the children were often rocking. Can you just say a little bit about that? What was that, and why do you think that was happening?
So the rocking was pretty ubiquitous when I went for the first time. So in 2007, so the kids would sort of, I don't think it was ever really explained to us, but sort of understood it as a sort of sign of an intense sort of emotional deprivation, a sort of comfort mechanism. So some kids would do it very, very slightly. Others would be very extreme, sort of whole body. Others would sort of lie on the floor and do it. When we had these we had these sort of discos at summer camp every week, and sort of 3 hours. It was exhausting and intense, and but yeah, the kids, when they heard the music, some of them would gather around the speakers and sort of rock. I mean, it's an extremely disturbing thing to witness. Although you, like all, I think you got sort of used to it. You didn't had less of an impact over time. And my understanding is you don't really see it anymore in the orphanage. There've been enough changes for the better in the orphanage that it's not. It's certainly not as common as it was when we went there for the first time.
That's very heartening to hear, at least, isn't it? Yeah, and. I mean, I think we'll talk a bit more about the orphanage as we go on, won't we? But before we plunge into talking about this fantastic cast of characters that make up your book, could you just say a few words also about why you decided on the title "Russia Starts Here"? What is that idea, and why perhaps is in your mind Pskov Region a useful prism to look at some questions about the fate of the whole of Russia?
So. The title of the book, Russia Starts Here, I nicked from this sign, which you can see, which is so that's the center of Pskov, and that's the Kremlin, river, obviously, and this is Россия начинается здесь, Russia starts here, this big sign that they erected on the side, on the riverbank. Which is kind of, it becomes this sort of marketing. I think in the mid-2010s they came up with this as like a marketing slogan for the region. You saw it on buses, on sort of promotional stuff for tourists. Interestingly, I discovered the sign itself. Initially, it was just Russia, so it was the Россия, but it was the first time that was installed. It was for an art exhibition, and the letters were taken from. Maybe some of you will remember the hotel that was on a red square opposite the Kremlin, the Hotel Russia. Okay. Yeah, and when they demolished that, the letters went into storage, but they got the letters out of storage and took them to Pskov and put them on the riverbank.
I thought it looked familiar.
Yeah. So those aren't the actual letters. I think they recreated it later, but like for this, when it was first put there, that's where it came from. So it comes from the sort of heart of Moscow to Pskov. Anyway, I thought I'd kind of take the marketing slogan at its word, right? The sort of the marketing people for the administration in Pskov, they would want you to think of the history, which we've talked about, culture. So Alexander Pushkin's family estate is in Pskov region. There's a very famous monastery, which we probably come on to talk a bit about as well, Pechori, which is is very important in Orthodoxy. I don't know, Mussorgsky, the composer, was born in the south of Pskov region. Rimsky-Korsakov had a dacha there. It has lots of links, these sort of cultural links, which...
so this is partly the idea of it being a sort of a western outpost of the country geographically, but it's also a kind of cradle of culture.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And your Russia starts there too, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I'm in the book, we've talked about this, like, writing about yourself, coming from a journalistic background, always found it very difficult. But I knew that to make the book work, I had to be there.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had it beaten out of us, haven't we? But you've plunged in there, and that's a really good thing that you did, I think. Yeah. It's a very personal story, isn't it?
Yeah. So it works for me. Like, that was kind of, I've always thought about Russia, from this starting point, these people and this place.
Now, I think there are three sort of themes that reverberate through the book, aren't there? There's one about the crippling depopulation of the area. There's also the impact, the psychological effects of the Second World War on the region, and also the consequences of the turmoil of the 1990s. So, but as with all good literature, your story flows from the characters. The issues come from the characters, not the other way around, which is what makes it so wonderful, I think. And indeed, the chapters often revolve around individual characters or couples, and so perhaps we could look briefly at some of those. And there are so many fascinating ones in the book. Well, I'm afraid we'll just have to pick a few, but some that maybe feel particularly illustrative of Pskov's peculiarities or its challenges. So maybe you could start off, Howard, talking about Nina and Mikhail. I think some of the first people who you met, aren't they? They're a couple in their 80s in the village where you first lived, and you say that they're in their 80s, but they're the future of the village of Baranovo, you say. So could you tell us a little about that and who they are?
So the village of Baranovo was next door to the village of Belskoustya, where the orphanage was, and this is where the volunteers lived during summer camp, and where I lived for almost a year as well. So I saw them regularly, got to know them quite well. Nina is now 90. So Nina was so their lives sort of span. They were both born before the Second World War, so their lives sort of span the sort of second half of the Soviet Union and modern Russia. And Nina in particular, so she was born in Baranovo. So one of she remembers that the whole of Pskov region was occupied by the Nazis during the war, and she remembers the occupation. She remembers the Nazis turning up in the village. She remembers the partisans.
She must have been very small, right? She was born in, was it 41 or?
No, she was born. No, she was born before then. But I can't remember.
Sorry,
exactly,
I got confused. It must be earlier if she's.
Yeah, a bit earlier. But she was sort of 7, 8, 9, 10, that sort of age. So she remembers this, and then after the war, her father was killed in the war. He was conscripted after the Red Army retook Pskov region, was killed in the war. And she moved to St. Petersburg, or then Leningrad, which is where she met Nikolai. And they married, they spent their working lives in St. Petersburg, and then they moved back when they retired to Baranovo, where, at the beginning of the 1990s. They were extremely kind to me, and I have a lot of fond memories. Nina was a wonderful cook, they're very hospitable. I love listening to their stories. I mean, I could listen to their stories about the partisans and the Nazis showing up for hours. It was fascinating for me.
Am I right, how in that intervening period while they'd been away, basically the sort of area and this village in particular, but kind of hollowed out, hadn't they, and almost deserted. So when they came back, they were effectively the only people there, weren't they? Or there was the only house that was occupied.
Yeah, exactly. So I use their story to introduce this idea of depopulation, which is extraordinary in Pskov region. Just so you have give you a figure. So the peak of the population in Pskov region was in the 1920s at about 1.8 million, and it's currently, as I think I said, just under 600,000. So in the course of a century, it's a third of what it was. So the village of Baranovo. So when Nina and her family moved there in 41, I think there were 20 plus people there. But gradually everyone moved away in I think mostly the 60s and the 70s. and it was deserted. So when they moved back in the beginning of the 90s, they were the only people in the village. They did up the old family house, and a couple of other houses were sort of quite shoddily built at that time. But now they are the only two people living permanently in the village, as they were at the beginning of the 90s. There were some people have come and gone, but they, as I said, they are the future. They're not going to live forever, and I think when they die, I can't really imagine that there's going to be anyone living there permanently.
Right. And obviously, this depopulation is partly to do with urbanization. It's partly to do with the catastrophic 1990s, but it obviously goes back deeper, further into collectivization, the tragedy of the war, the sheer number of people who were killed, and so on. That's another theme we've said, isn't it, that comes up a lot, is the Second World War and how that cascades down the generations, the effects of it. So could we talk a bit about Sergei Kirin, who's another subject of one of your chapters?
So Sergei, Sergei was a Russian. He served in the Soviet army. He was a captain in the Soviet army in reconnaissance. He fought in Afghanistan, but I found him because he was working for an organisation called the Volksbund, which is a German organisation, sort of similar to the UK's War Graves Commission, Commonwealth War Graves Commission, that look after the graves of German soldiers. And so after Pskov region was occupied during the war, and there were lots of German cemeteries, German burials of German soldiers in that region from the fighting, further north towards Leningrad. And after the war, all these cemeteries were destroyed.
On Stalin's orders, I think you said, is that right?
Yeah, that was the policy, was to that the Soviet Union, having suffered so much, wasn't going to sort of tend these German cemeteries, and so they were all destroyed. In some case, and stuff was built on top of them, houses, factories,
football
stadiums, yeah. And so this is how I came across the work of the Volksbund in Pskov region. Was the town nearest the orphanage is a town called Porkhov. They had when I first went there, this brand new football stadium which looked completely out of place because it was an extremely depressed place, and it looked like nothing new had been built there for at least 40, 50 years. But this football stadium stood out like a sore thumb, and the story behind it was that had been the site of a German cemetery in the Second World War. That was then they built the football stadium on top of it, and then the Volksbund came along, led by Sergei Kirin, because he was responsible for the Pskov region for the Volksbund, and they pay the local administration. The football stadium was closed. They exhumed I think it's about 2,500 German. Soldiers, the remains of German soldiers that were left there, and then the money that the Volksbund gave was used to build this nice new stadium.
Just to be clear, as I understood it, until then players were playing on a sort of dusty dirt pitch, and the bones were coming up through the pitch, and they were tripping over them while they were playing. Yeah,
this was a story that was told to me. So one of the actually the guy who did the sort of PE classes at the orphanage. This was the story that he told me. Yeah, that he'd played on that pitch in the the 80s. And the bones would sometimes come to the surface. Yeah.
Extraordinary, yeah. But obviously, this is Sergei is a former Soviet army officer. You said, didn't you? It must have been quite a tricky assignment for him. I mean, I think you say in the book that it's not a state-organized effort in Russia to recover Soviet soldiers' remains. It's done by individual groups and volunteers and so on. So, I mean, him working for the German organization rather than being involved in recovering Soviet soldiers. That must have laid him open to some criticism from friends or people locally.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. He's he's full of contradictions. Yeah, he's very much a Russian nationalist. He fought in the Soviet he fought for the Soviet army, but then he was doing this job collecting the remains of German soldiers, which he was clearly very good at. I think I kind of understood he was very obsessive. He was clearly very obsessive. He was very careful. He was very methodical. He was very sort of consumed by the sort of hunting, like finding these cemeteries, which are sometimes very difficult to find. And then he uses special sort of wire tools to, figure out if there are bodies buried in the ground. And and then you have to persuade the people to allow the exhumations to take place. And I think a lot of that part of the work appealed to him because he was quite open about it with me. He had very bad PTSD from his experience in Afghanistan. He was wounded in Afghanistan, like physically he was quite damaged, and I think this job was a kind of lifeline in that respect. But yes, it did sit oddly with his nationalism. He was I interviewed him before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but he sort of vaguely stayed in touch by email, and he turned out to be a big supporter of Russia in Ukraine. And when we sat one evening, this is the cemetery, the German cemetery in Pskov Region near a town called Sebij, and we sat one evening in a cafe in Sebij, and we had a long conversation. And we had a sort of classic sort of when he gave me a lecture about LGBT stuff, which I hadn't asked about, and how Russia was opposed and didn't like the way the West was sort of dictating to them. So we had this which sits very oddly with someone who doing the job he was doing. But yeah, he was a guy full of contradictions, I think, in some way.
One thing that struck me was when you talked about that, because obviously part of his job is going, there are some of these remains which were covered over or destroyed, temporary cemeteries from the war, on private property, and he had to go to people's houses or businesses and say, can we recover these German bones and take them to the big, properly organized cemetery also here on Russian territory? Is that right? And you were saying that he found that quite often it was the older people who were helpful, and in that. You might think that they were the people who had even seen the horrors of the war and they might be opposed to this process, but actually it was younger people who were more objecting. Did you come to a kind of conclusion about why that was?
Yeah, he basically said it himself that the older people, they'd seen it, they were more forgiving, and the younger people, they hadn't seen the horrors of the Second World War. What they'd been brought up on was, the Soviet, cult of the Second World War, which has sort of been repackaged and sort of done up by Putin, which is very closely intertwined with nationalism, and the younger people, that was a sort of immediately their reaction was hostile, whereas because of that, I think it was the lack of direct experience and exposure
not necessarily
to this
what you might expect, was it? Yeah. So some of the characters you explore in the book are historical ones, or ones that you're not able to meet personally, but that sort of intrigue you. And one of those, perhaps most familiar to the audience, or to me at least, is Father Tikhon Shevkunov, isn't it? The Orthodox bishop who a lot of people know or think of as Putin's personal confessor. So could you just remind us who he is and say a little bit about what his link to Pskov region, and what did you find out about him?
So this is Tikhon on the left. So his link to Pskov region is he was as a novice at this monastery that I mentioned, the Pechori Caves Monastery, which is right on the Estonian border. And then he came back and when was it, 2018, that end of the 2010s, he was abbot there for a chunk of time. So it was kind of where, this Pechori was kind of where he found religion. And I tried and failed to get an interview with him, so it was all based talking to other people. But he is a fascinating character. He clearly has some influence over Russian president, in the realm of ideas. It's what he's sort of whispering in his ear or preaching to him or whatever. But a lot has been written about Tikhon. But I was most interested, I think, in his early years. So he was a film. So he was studied at VGIG, which was the Soviet Union's premier film school. It still exists. It's still a very good film school. So he learnt, that's his background, and then he found religion when he was at the school, in part by going to this Pechori monastery, which I can show you. That's Pechori, I was particularly fascinated by the sort of stories from Pechori in the 80s, when there were people like Tikhon, who recently embraced orthodoxy, very sort of passionate about it, and then much older monks who, some of whom had suffered very badly under the Soviet regime, been imprisoned and so on. But I found a monk who'd been there, who said, had these fascinating sort of glimpses in that it was, everything for them was very real. Demons were real; they were there. Exorcisms were real. If you talk to people who went to Peshawar in the 80s, everyone mentions the fact that they came across these ostensibly mad people screaming and making weird noises and doing strange things who'd come there for the exorcisms. And this monk he's very critical of all this. He said, I can't remember the exact quote, but he said something like, they talked about all this stuff, but they never talked about Christ. It was also a very sort of authoritarian strain of orthodoxy. The abbot at the time in the 80s, someone called Gavril, was clearly very authoritarian in his outlook. There are different strands within the Orthodox Church, and he was at the authoritarian end. And he, there are stories about him. I think Tikhon recounts this story about him asking someone who wanted to become a novice at the monastery, saying, "Well, prove your sort of devotion by kicking that monk over there." And the novice, very keen to make an impression, goes over and kicks this monk. I mean, it's a very this sort of violence was quite this sort of extreme obedience was quite valued. Anyway, so this is the background of Tikhon, and Tikhon goes on to become this he moves to Moscow, published, this is one of the most successful non-fiction books that's been published in Russia since the end of the Soviet Union about Pichori in the 80s. That, by the way, is Tikhon on the left as a sort of as a student, a film student. And he becomes this very influential figure who, he's deeply conservative, he's very patriarchal, and he's an imperialist as well. And some people argue that the things he's been dripping in Putin's ears over the course of many years are one of the reasons why, Russia's doing what it is doing in Ukraine.
And you talk in the book also interestingly about when he turns up in Moscow, and then we don't exactly know how he first came to know Putin, but there certainly is some kind of personal link there, isn't there? But you also talk about him in an interesting way about how he sort of turns up at meetings, and he's kind of rather unkempt, maybe even a bit smelly. And there's an immediate, obviously, connection to the idea of Rasputin, isn't there? As this kind of slightly uncontrollable but powerfully charismatic, goatee-smelling, maybe not in, but maybe not in Shevkunov's case. But there's a sort of parallel there, isn't there?
Yeah, I spoke to this academic who'd been on a committee with him in the early 2000s, so before he was really sort of famous, probably after he'd made Putin's acquaintance, and she had this extraordinary description of him that he turned up to this meeting in like some sort of sports car, and he was this sort of unkempt, unkempt and just no one could take their eyes off him. He was so sort of like charismatic. Everyone around this table was just sort of mesmerizing presence, and she was like, it was Rasputin. It's like it was her only association with it. I think he's to be fair, I think he's cleaned up his image since then in a very sort of conscious way. One of the things I hope comes across is that he's very aware of presentation and propaganda and communication, and he understands how to do that. I think he's very much sort of cleaned up his image. He's more of a sort of efficient church bureaucrat / there was an FT profile of him when he was compared to Russell Crowe as well, as sort of very sort of slick movie sort of star.
And very much an advocate of that sort of national imperialism, the idea that Russia can only be an empire, that it can't exist in any other guise. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's a totally convinced imperialist. It's a bit unclear where he thinks Russia's borders should be, whether he just wants the former Soviet Union, whether he wants the Russian Empire restored, whether he thinks Russia should control Constantinople. But yeah, he's very much an advocate of that Russia. If Russia is not an empire, then it's nothing. Yeah.
So, fascinating. Thank you. Now, let's move back now to a character though that you knew personally and very well. who also actually became really quite well known across Russia, didn't he? And that is Dima Markov, the photographer, who became known for his wonderfully sort of gritty but also touching pictures of everyday life in Russia. So how did you come to know him, and tell us a little bit about him? Who was he?
So I first met Dima when I went to Pskov Region for the first time, when I went to summer camp for the first time. He was also a volunteer there. He when he introduced himself on the train, we were on the overnight train from Moscow. When he introduced himself, it was as a photographer, and he immediately got out his camera and was showing. I have a vivid memory of him showing everyone pictures on the back of his SLR camera that he'd taken, and he was at that summer camp, and then he left the summer camp
So he was another volunteer.
Exactly,
working alongside you.
Exactly,
but also taking pictures at the same time.
Also taking pictures at the same time. Yeah, that image you saw of the boy in the orphanage, that was one of his images. So he took a lot of photos then, and then he set up this, what I suppose what you call a sort of children's village near the orphanage, and he fostered some of the children from the orphanage, and they lived at this village, sort of halfway house, helping them get out of the system. And so he sort of combined this social work and his photography, but his photography, I think, really, I mean, he became famous when he switched to just taking photos on his iPhone, and he used Instagram, and his images became, I think, very well known, and they sort of kind of define in a way how people in Moscow and St. Petersburg saw, the regions in Russia. He loved taking photos of, I'll show you some in a second. He loved taking photos of sort of on the edge of Russian towns, these sort of the Soviet sort of apartment blocks that you find in every Russian town or city, and his subjects are the marginalized. So he took photos of the orphans when we were there, but he takes a lot of photos of children. He takes photos of the homeless, disabled people, conscripts. People who are conscripts, so people who are so vulnerable people, basically, that he sort of spotlights them, and the backgrounds are always these sort of edges of depressed towns, kids jumping off garage roofs, or these sorts of. Once you've seen a Markov image, you can usually spot it again. Yeah.
And I get the impression that he was quite a kind of wild card in a way. He was very, he was careless of rules, but he was very charismatic. He was charming. At one point you said you felt he was quite intimidating sometimes. He was this kind of ball of energy, talking all the time. He also has a drug problem. Could you say a bit more about that? What was his relationship with the children? In the orphanage, how did they find him? I did. I found him intimidating. He was this very successful photographer, and he had at that point his blog on LiveJournal, which was very popular at the time, and he was sort of minor celebrity, and he was sort of someone who didn't suffer fools very gladly. But with the kids, I think so. The first summer camp, he was the kids. He worked with the older boys, so some of the most sort of normal kids in the orphanage, and the most capable kids in the orphanage, intellectually speaking. And they did a lot. He taught them how to break dance. He could break dance. They sort of did tattoos. They adored him. Some of the other volunteers weren't that keen on him because he was quite sweary as well, I think.
He was sweary, drank a lot. Like, he wasn't very interested in doing sort of communal stuff, particularly. He was there really. He was there to take photos,
right?
Because this summer camp, this orphanage was a very closed place. It was very difficult to get access to places like this in Russia, and the summer camp was this window, this opportunity, and he used it.
And he was clearly a person who was full of empathy, and he helped arrange this halfway house from which I guess. The older children left the orphanage, didn't they, and went there before they tried to launch themselves into kind of normal life, if you like. So he's obviously very committed, but he was also a heroin addict. How did he manage that?
Yeah, I mean, so Dima died of a heroin overdose. Eventually, was the day before Navalny's death, and yeah, so he struggled, and at the time, I mean, he was a heroin addict at the time of that summer camp, but I didn't know, or certainly didn't know about it then. I don't think other people did. But he was very open about it latterly. Like, he talked a lot about it publicly. He wrote about it. I mean, it's speculation. I think he went through periods when he was using a lot and when he was using less. Before he died, I sort of spoke to him a couple of times. We had sort of long chats, and he told me a bit about his personal history. And he had these sort of big breaks in his life. He grew up in a sort of commuter town of Moscow, and then moved to Moscow, became a journalist. Then he moved to Pskov Region to set up this children's village thing. Then he moved back to Moscow, and then he moved to live in Pskov. And then when he died, I remember him saying he was planning to move back to Moscow. So he had these sort of big breaks, which I think were a way of trying to control the addiction, or like temporarily.
Do we have more of his photos to click through, by the way? Yeah. And what was his take on the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I don't really have the answer to that. I mean, this is one of his best, maybe his best photos, which was taken during the war in Ukraine. It's at the railway station in Pskov. This is a conscript, and these are the people seeing off the conscripts from the train for their year's military service. And obviously in the context of what Russia was doing in Ukraine, it has a lot of obvious meaning. So his relationship, so he lived like among these people, right? He shared a flat with so in Pskov there's a famous regiment, the paratrooper regiment. He shared a flat with a paratrooper. Like, he knew these guys. He told me that when the invasion started, he knew a couple of people serving in the regiment. The regiment was one of the was sent straight into Ukraine, and he texted them like good luck, or maybe not good luck. I think it was like keep safe or something.
Keep safe, yeah.
Safe. Mm-hmm. And their phones are already off, but so he very much. I think he thought the invasion was madness and it wasn't going to end well for anyone. But I think he very much sympathized with those that he could see, the young men returning to Pskov, with no limbs, missing limbs, who's, watched their friends die. One of his last posts on Telegram, I think, was this. It's an image of someone just come back from Ukraine who's sitting there sobbing. So yeah, that's where his sympathies lie. I think he was, professed his love for Russia, at every turn. He decided not to leave at the beginning of the invasion. He would have been able to, financially, if he'd wanted to. So I think he maybe would have tended towards that maybe sort of moral equivalence between the two sides, and he was most, I think, compassionate about the victims that he could see with his.
And there's a striking bit in the book where you ask him why he thinks that people go off to fight, and he talks about the fact that people are trying to escape their humdrum lives, to get away from debt, from terrible lack of opportunity, no jobs and things. And that when you go to fight in a war, it becomes a stark existential battle of survival. Yeah. That was very striking, and I wondered if perhaps that in some way was kind of he identified with that because of his struggle with the addiction. Because when you become a serious heroin addict, you are also in an existential struggle, aren't you? Your life is pared down to survival. Yeah,
I think absolutely. That's when he said that to me, he was thinking about. His own battle with heroin. Right. He was thinking about himself, but he was also drawing on his experience of interacting with the people that who lived in small towns of Pskov region, and their motivations for going to war. I think his observations were very acute, really.
Yeah. And this is the great thing about your book, Howard, is all the characters who have such complex feelings in them, which is so true, isn't it? We don't necessarily have, or can't have, someone in his situation have a completely stark idea about whether people should be going to war or not. Terrible and monstrous as we know it is, we can see how he might have felt sympathy with those people. On that note, you also, and maybe a last character we could look at is a man called, you just called Mikhail, I think, isn't it? Who ends up going to fight in the war in Ukraine. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
So this isn't Mikhail. This is another of Dima's images, but it's of a enlistment office. Mikhail. It's a pseudonym. It's not his real name. But I interviewed his widow. So he lived in Pskov Region, in a small town in Pskov Region. He had two young daughters, one of whom was, I think, 6 months, and the other was 3 or 4. In the autumn of 2022, he volunteered to go and fight in Ukraine. He got a couple of months training. He was sent to Ukraine, and he was killed, I think, in an artillery. He was in a dugout, got hit by an artillery shell, and he was killed within a couple of days arriving there. Not entirely clear, but it looks unlikely that he ever fired his weapon in anger. So I spoke to his widow, and that's what the information, trying to understand really his motivations for going to war. And for him it seemed to be, it's all anecdotal, but for him it seemed to be what Dima had been talking about, it was an escape from a very sort of humdrum existence. I think he worked at the local cement factory, there was some sort of romance and glamour in going to war. He was clearly drawn to this, and the Russian the sort of propaganda they use for trying to entice people to sign contracts plays on this idea of traditional ideas for what men should be doing and being a real man. I think that was an appeal to him. He definitely saw the army as a sort of social lift. But perhaps even more interestingly was like what he didn't believe. So from speaking to his wife, she said she didn't believe either any of the propaganda that this was Russian land, or that Ukrainians were Nazis, or that NATO was about to invade Russia. They lived a few dozen kilometers from the border with NATO, and they clearly this had no resonance for them at all. He also, at least from her words, it sounded as if he wasn't interested in the money. So Russian volunteers get huge amounts of money to sign up and as salaries when they're in the army, and then if they're killed, their families get a lot of money. But that didn't seem to be a motivation for him as well. It was exactly what Dima was talking about, this sort of ennui, sort of total lack of opportunity, this appeal of something, the simplicity of living or dying.
Yeah. Although he did talk about wanting to go to kill Hakhli, didn't the Ukrainians?
Yes, so there was obviously some of that sort of ethnic hatred. That did.
But it's certainly, even his widow, it's striking how she sort of struggles to find any meaning in it, and she doesn't seem to have. She seems quite fatalistic about it. She has quite low expectations about what should happen to her as a result, how she should go forward.
Yeah, that was very striking. So her story was interesting as well, and I write about her in the book. And she was brought up in Russia's orphanage system. She was training to be a nurse, but then she met Mikhail, and she got pregnant, and then they got married. And it was very sort of, you would expect someone who'd experienced the Russian state in the form of an orphanage, and then experienced the Russian state as this thing which took her husband off to his death. She'd be angry about it, but there was no anger directed at the Russian state or its manifestations. She was very struck by her sort of acceptance of it all. Yeah.
And you say at the beginning of the book that you came to understand your book as a sort of a response to the question of how this terrible war was possible. What are the roots of this darkness, is what, as you put it. And we do see in the book that several of these otherwise very sympathetic characters that one can easily warm to are quite gung-ho about the war, that they're supportive of it, basically. So have you come to some general conclusions about why so many Russians actively or tacitly at least approve of the war?
Yeah, so I started writing the book before the war started, and it was always intended as trying to understand, I suppose, more broadly why Russians support, the regime or Putin. And then when the war started, it very much became about what. I mean, I don't sort of give you a list of reasons why I think Russians support the war, but for me it became a way of trying to understand that phenomenon, because. If you look at the Russia's casualties in the war, it's overwhelmingly borne by regions like Pskov, and I jotted it down because I wanted to say it was so in Pskov region, the latest data we have. This is from independent people who are counting Russia's death toll. 700 people for Pskov's population is 600,000, so 700 dead. Russian soldiers from Pskov region, a population of 600,000. For Moscow, which has 12 million people, there's 1,300 deaths. So I think that just illustrates,
isn't it?
yeah. So the people who are being killed in this war are young. They're not young. They're men from I think more middle-aged men from regions like Pskov. And I think, I don't think there's a really sort of straightforward answer. I think Dima's answer is quite a compelling one about why volunteering to fight in a war like that or supporting a war like that would be appealing. I think what we talked about, the experience of the Second World War, how that is played out, the experience of the 1990s, and how all these things kind of come together. I don't think there's a sort of...
No, and in fact, I'm asking for a straightforward answer, but in fact, your book is the answer, isn't it? Your book is the great, long, involved, sophisticated answer, so it's a bit of an unfair question. We should read the book, and that's how we find out, isn't it? So, finally, how do you gave up your home in Russia in 2022, I think, didn't you? You maybe went back for one slightly risky visit in 2023, and that was the last one, am I right?
Yeah.
So... Now, looking back, you can't go there. You had this wonderful connection with Pskov region, with the people there. How do you look at it now? How do you rationalize it? Are you in touch with people there?
A few, sort of sporadically. Yeah, I mean, Nina and Nikolai sends me these sort of gifts on WhatsApp of every sort of religious festival. Sort of a little bit. There are some people, that I kind of I haven't been in touch with that much. That I kind of almost don't want to, because I don't want to hear that they support the invasion. There was one woman who I thank in the acknowledgements, and she was also very kind to me over many years, but she blocked me recently. I wanted to tell her about the birth of my daughter, but she'd blocked me. I know she's a very nationalist, and I imagine she'd seen the title of the book and made her assumptions. It's sporadic. In touch with people there.
You do say, though, in your chapter about the orphanage, that you feel there have been some improvements there, because for me, reading the book, that was one of the most distressing things to read about children who are behaving in the way that they were, rocking obsessively because they're emotionally deprived and so on. That's very hard to imagine that thought, that reality. But I think you felt that there are some improvements there in the orphanage.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more distant from it now than I was, 5 or 10 years ago. But that's my impression, is that, well, to an extent. So materially, it's much better. Like in that photo of Dima's, you saw they had these metal grills which they'd lock across the corridors, so trapping the kids behind them, for overnight, so they wouldn't get out, caging them effectively. But those have been taken down. There's much less rocking. Like there's fewer kids to the bedrooms. They have things like kitchens that the kids can use. There's more money, basically. There's more money. There's still not a lot of money, but there is more money. And money, even more money can't solve, the problems of, they don't have enough specialists because it's in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, but I think it is better in some respects, but I think the basic truth remains that, these kids don't have enough emotionally. They're still emotionally deprived, maybe slightly less than they were. Maybe sort of bringing it together. Recently, I discovered a Russian journalist wrote an article about children with disabilities who, or people with disabilities who sent to fight in Ukraine, and discovered that one of the kids at the orphanage that Dima worked with when he was there in 2007 had volunteered to go and fight in Ukraine and had been wounded in Ukraine, which is kind of extraordinary to me that they're sending graduates from institutions like that. Yeah.
Wow. And okay, then a final question, if I may, before we go over to questions from everyone here. You know, and I think this is, well, it's a conundrum that I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people here do as well. You know, I think there are probably a lot of people here who feel a kind of deep connection with Russia in the same way that you do. You know, we forged relationships there. We had wonderful experiences, despite the despicable things that have happened there. What can we do with that love for Russia now? Can that still be valid? I mean, how do we square it with the absolutely despicable things that we see happening in Ukraine in Russia's name?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't think I have an answer. I mean, it's just I do remember at the beginning of the war, I kind of stopped working on the book. I just couldn't. I was very busy with other stuff, but I also couldn't quite face it. You know, I was worried that empathy would slip into justification, and you know, with time, it's become, you know, that it's become easier, and I think it is. I mean, I kind of see. I don't know what you think, Tom, but like we, as journalists, and you know, people writing about Russia, your role is really to help other people, more important people, understand maybe what's going on in the country and why it's happening, and that is, I think, you know, as important, maybe even more important now that it's very difficult to get information out of Russia. So I don't have any sort of easy answers. It's a sort of it's very painful, but I sort of feel like turning your back on it is maybe not the most productive thing to do either.
So you can imagine yourself back in Russia?
Not in the near future, I don't think. No. I mean, maybe, hopefully, one day, but not imminently. I don't know if you can or if you...
We'll be there, Howard. We'll be there one day. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's absolutely... Yeah, thank you, Howard, for that brilliant talk. And you know, I do urge everyone who hasn't got the book already to take the opportunity to get it tonight. It's really an absolutely wonderful thing. You won't regret it. And it's about time I shut up and we went over to your questions. So Rachel will handle that.
Anyone got any questions?
Hi, thank you. Really interesting. I was wondering how you found the process of talking to people and interviewing people. Of course, Russia is a place where often people are hesitant to open up. And how was that? I mean, being a journalist, of course, is difficult there in general, but also just getting people's stories.
Yeah, it's a sort of mixed... I mean, yeah, over the course of the 15 years that I was, working there as a journalist, it did become harder, I think. There was more suspicion of, foreigners, but and particularly foreign journalists. But, I mean, to be honest, mostly people are very happy to talk to you. They're often very interested in who you are and why you're there, and flattered that you're asking them about their lives. And and being a foreigner, work cuts two ways. Sometimes you will encounter people who are like, I don't want to talk to this sort of is risky, or I don't agree with you, or they make judgments based on your nationality. But then the flip side is that you're much more interesting than a Russian reporter, and often people are very fascinated by it, and that leads them to open up perhaps even more than they would under other circumstances. You maybe understand this is the only time they're gonna see me. Like, it's not like I'm gonna. It sort of feels a bit exotic. So you are in quite a privileged position as a sort of a foreign reporter like that. And even when I went back to Russia in 2023, so when the war was on, the people are astonishingly open sometimes. Not all the time, but often. Yeah.
Hi. So I read your book and really enjoyed it. That's not quite the right word, actually. It was very moving and very touching on a number of levels. The question I asked myself as I was reading is what made you go to an orphanage? I mean, I sort of visualize, say, when I remember when I was, 18, 19 or 20, I don't think I would have had the capacity or the margins to go to a foreign country and work in an orphanage. So what was it that triggered you to do such an adventure?
I mean, the reasons they're quite prosaic, really. I studied Russian at school, but then I was studying history at university, and I wanted to use my Russian. I wanted to go to Russia, and I heard about that this charity was looking for volunteers who had some knowledge of Russian, and I thought it was a good opportunity to go and improve my Russian. I think I also thought it sounded like a good thing to do, but obviously I had almost no idea of what I was letting myself in for. And wanted to go to and see more of Russia. I think I'd been to Moscow and St. Petersburg at that point, but I was interested in other parts of the country as well. So it really was as simple as that. It was nothing very sophisticated. Yeah. The question was, how did I cope with it emotionally? It's interesting. I've thought quite a lot about it. I mean, there were a lot of students like me there, and we managed at the time because it was quite new for everyone. It was exciting, overwhelming. But I do find, if you talk to other volunteers, I think a lot of people that hadn't seen anything remotely like that before, and if I talk to other volunteers, even now, what are we? Getting over 20 years later, people have very vivid memories of it, and you talk about it, and the names come flooding back. The names of the carers in the orphanage, Valentina Ivanovna, and all the kids. It did have a very profound impact on people. I mean, it was a very disturbing experience, I think, in some ways, that sort of stays with you. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, I was very interested that you've been back since the full-scale invasion. I haven't been since then, like probably lots of people here, and I just wanted to know what changes you've observed there, if any.
So I went back for a month in February 2023, so about a year after the full-scale invasion, and I went back to finish doing the research for the book. I mean, the first thing was I went to Moscow, and it was bizarre because I'd lived in Moscow for a decade or more, and I barely knew anyone in the city. Like, everyone that I knew had left. All the foreign journalists had gone. Pretty much all of my Russian friends had left. But the most striking thing was that at that time I was editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times, and we were writing every day about the war and its consequences. And that's what I was thinking about, every day professionally. And then I was living in Yerevan, and there were lots of Russians who'd left Russia because of the war in Yerevan. So the conversations in the evenings were all about the war as well. And then when I come back home to the UK, and also people would want to ask about what I thought about the war and so on. I felt like it was that's what life was about at that point. And then you went back to Moscow, and no one wanted to talk about it. It's too painful, they're scared, whatever. And it was like this place where you go to forget that the war was happening. It was extraordinary. There are a few billboards up in the street, but that was pretty much it. And then when I went to Pskov, obviously, and it was the same there. There was no outward sign of the war, but there were two things that stuck in my mind. Was in Pskov, one was I went to the cemetery just outside the city that they use for the burials of this famous paratrooper division, and because Russia is so opaque, the information about Russia's casualties, that going to the cemeteries is one way you can sort of gauge it. Anyway, it's a very beautiful spot, and have this cemetery. Anyway, I wanted to go and see the cemetery with my own eyes. I turned up there, and a funeral was underway. They were preparing. The hearse was about to arrive. They were preparing the burial site, and it wasn't the place for a foreigner amongst all these soldiers. So I left immediately. But it was a sort of stark reminder that under the surface, that's what these burials are going on every few days. And the other incident was one of the chapters in the book is about the Red Army soldier who was the first one to raise the red flag over the Reichstag, and I interviewed his great granddaughter, and she invited me around to her flat in Pskov, and we were sort of chatting over tea, and she sort of mentioned at one point that her boyfriend was next door, and he was a soldier, and he just got back to Ukraine, and he was recovering from a wound he'd received in Ukraine. So, on the surface, it was very easy to forget about it, but you only have to scratch the surface, and it was there.
Would you say something about what you observed when you went back about attitudes to what people were hearing in the state media about the war at the time, and have you observed any changes in that?
To the narratives, or to well, I think one of the narratives at that point, I think, is still is the case, is that it's sort of downplaying the scale and the magnitude and the awfulness of it, so it becomes a sort of routine that people don't think about, and I think that was what I've just said. That was quite evident, that there were very few outward signs. I think at the beginning of the war there were lots of Zeds up, not lots, but there were Zeds up, and it was quite visible. But very quickly that there was a decision taken that wasn't what they wanted to do, and that to sort of normalise it was what they wanted to do. And I think that was very obvious in terms of the propaganda. Like Nina and Nikolai, the old couple, I went to see them, and I'm not sure if I mentioned, but they are also supporters of the war. And I was kind of dreading that conversation because I thought they probably would be, but I didn't really want to hear it. But one of their connections with the outside world, because they live in this village where they're the only people who live there, is the TV, and they do absorb a lot of the stuff that comes out the TV and repeat it to you. And they what their understanding, or certainly Nikolai's understanding, they saw it as a sort of continuation of the Second World War in the way that they talked about it. And I think that's also a propaganda narrative as well, obviously. So yeah, I think those are the two main things.
May I ask another question? I was interested to know, are you aware of any of the children who were in the orphanage who left, and at least in a sort of material sense have been successful in their lives, who have gone on to find a path, of find jobs and so on? Are you still in touch with anyone who's kind of progressed into life in a successful way? I'm really hoping you'll say yes.
Not really. So when I went there for the first time in 2007, there were some of the older children there were sort of more intellectually able. I that was particularly heartbreaking because they shouldn't have been in that orphanage. I think I don't know, but the supposition is that maybe they were badly behaved and they were sort of pushed down the orphanage system into orphanages it should have been for kids who were more physically and intellectually disabled. So some of them, like one of them, well, I mentioned one of them who fought in the war in Ukraine. Off the top, there are a couple living in the local town from that sort of generation in the orphanage. There was one who who's lives more or less independently. But subsequently, most of the children, it's not feasible really to live independently. Some of them live in. There's a charity that runs sort of these halfway houses. So some of them live at their. Latterly, the orphanage has set up its own sort of, I suppose, halfway house for kids when they turn 18 who can live there in a nearby village. Some of them live there, but most of them go on to these places called adult institutions. Well, certainly when we went there for the first time, most of them would go on to places called adult institutions, which are where they'd live for the rest of their lives. So vanishingly small numbers. But I mean, I'm not sure even if they had all the care and love in the world that they'd ever be able to live independent lives, because some of them had quite severe, physical and intellectual disabilities. So, but the sort of, I don't know if you want success stories that are vanishingly small. Yeah.
But in a wider sense, in terms of the people that you met and the experiences that you had there are sort of cycles of goodness in a way, aren't there? Can you feel any glimmer of hope about how they might manifest themselves at some point in the future? I mean, I think I, like you, feel very pessimistic in my journalistic mind about what's going to be happening in Russia for the next 10 or 20 years. But my sort of lived in Russia person wants to be hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, there are... obviously, I mean, there are lots of places from which you can draw hope. Politically, I mentioned this democratic tradition in. For me, that's the sort of hopeful message in the book, is that a lot of people believe that Russia is doomed to cycles of authoritarianism, violence, and strong hand in the Kremlin or whatever. But there is a different political tradition that does exist. But yeah, I mean, there are lots of. I hope some of the stories in the book come across the sort of, the empathy, the humanity, the people doing good things.
And there is one local politician, isn't there, Lev Schlossberg, who very much embodies that hope and belief in an alternative kind of existence in the region. So he's maybe the most famous sort of opposition politician still at liberty in Russia. He's a member of Yabloko, the Liberal Party, but is the sort of more independent end of Yabloko, if that makes sense. And he somehow continues to function in Pskov despite opposing the war and sort of criticizing the regime. I mean, he's a sort of hair's breadth away from being put in prison, but he's still at liberty. And I mean, I sort of make the argument. I mean, it's a bit of a ridiculous argument, but he's kind of embodies this sort of democratic tradition going back to the medieval period. And he was very interested in Pskov's heritage and history. That's kind of how he came to politics as well. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there are any more questions. If not, maybe that sort of Will, sorry, I was going to say though that sort of thought about enduring resilience is quite a nice kind of moment to end on, isn't it? But Will, go ahead.
I promise I'll make it short.
No rush.
You've mentioned that the sort of identity of the Pskov region sort of depends in part on it being this sort of border, the sort of the Russia's front line as it's looking towards the west. Do you see that changing as Russia expands its influence in its territory, and if so, how?
I mean, it's very hard to imagine that Russia would be able to push its border westward into the Baltic states. I mean, that would, end in some huge military conflagration, I think. I don't think that's realistic in the near future. I think for the moment Pskov will remain as a border region, which is, we were talking about I was talking about the democratic sort of heritage, opposition politicians like Schlossberg in Pskov would espouse, but the authorities they very much make a point of Pskov as this military outpost, on the edge of orthodoxy. As you move into the Baltics, the religion shifts, and as this outpost defending, Russia from the perfidious West. So yeah, I don't think. I mean, there is plenty of scope for military conflict in that area, I think, but I can't imagine the current state of affairs that Russia has a realistic chance of launching an invasion of Estonia or something from Pskov region.
Just two short questions. Is there any grounds for optimism in terms of Pskov's economic revival? One. And then the second, is there evidence of Pskov benefiting from the sort of war economy and sort of military salaries washing through the economy? I don't know if Pskov has much of a military industrial base.
What was the first question? Sorry, I just quite... economic
grounds of optimism in terms of general
economic. I think probably not. It's tried to make money off tourism. That is a possibility. It does have, Pechori, these Pushkin Hills, and lots of other sites. It's relatively accessible from Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think they have tried to make some money on that. I mean, traditionally it would make quite a lot of money from trade, but I think even before the war, I mean, those borders are. There's very little going across those borders now, but even before the war, I think the money from that went to Moscow anyways. I don't think that did anything for the local economy, really. Agriculture is quite marginal, it's much more profitable in, southern Russia, the fertile areas of southern Russia. I think there is some scope for agriculture, but I don't think it's... and it's never been a place of industry. Pskov region's never had much industry, which is another draw in terms of tourism because it's relatively unpolluted and it does have some very beautiful parts of it. In terms of the war economy, yeah, it's very interesting. So when I went back in 2023, there wasn't any, to me, obvious signs of that. So maybe for others who don't know, the idea is that the huge payments that Russia makes to volunteer soldiers and their families if they're killed, and also to the people working in the defense industry, because unemployment is record low in Russia because they're desperate for people to work in defense industry and defense-related industries, that this has acted as a sort of an economic boost for deprived regions. It's distributed wealth in a sort of left-wing way, which a lot of people would have been very happy to see if it not been done for this to sustain the war in Ukraine. So when I went back in 2023, I didn't see any sort of sign of that economic boost, but and Pskov doesn't have military industry. It's too close to the border. All the military defense stuff in Russia is further east. It would be seen as too vulnerable, so it doesn't have that. But I mean, as I've said, there are a lot of soldiers from Pskov region, and a lot of people have been killed from Pskov region and injured. I didn't see any sign of that in 2023, but maybe you wouldn't just from walking around. And I don't know about any data, but I would imagine, yeah, because there is money coming in from that, the sort of the soldiers. Yeah, I would imagine there's a bit of that. But yeah, there isn't. It's not like I think this sort of redistribution of wealth has been more noticeable in other sort of more central parts of Russia, I think.
Have we got time for one more question if anyone's got one?
Thank you, Tom, for your book. It is wonderful. And could I just say that everything Tom has said about it is absolutely true. It's a very powerful and moving description of the Pskov region and the people who live there. As we're in Pushkin House, I just had one question. I was very interested to read in your book about the Pushkin Hills Museum, the Mikhailovskaya estate. Is that museum still thriving, and is it still, if you like, one of the positive pluses in the region, would you say?
So for people who haven't read the book, so Pushkin Hills it's a museum, although museum doesn't really, it's more like a sort of national park as we would understand it. There's Mikhailovskaya, which is Pushkin's family estate, but there are other estates that he visited which are also incorporated into this huge territory, which is, so in the Soviet times it was hugely popular, but people were bussed in on part of tours, and maybe it was entirely their choice, but it is still it does get hundreds of, I think, I can't remember, maybe like 1 million people a year. It's like it is quite a big draw. And it is an extremely beautiful place. It doesn't, there's no sort of analogue I can give you in the UK or something. It takes you several days to go round, and it has been preserved. There's not a lot of changes have been made since the Soviet period. I think it's pretty similar to what it was back then, and a lot of the same people are still in charge. It has a bit more money than it did in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, I think, but the ethos is very similar to what it was. It's I found it fascinating because you're sort of going back in time when you visit it as well in some ways. That is a fascinating place that gets a lot of. Is one of the tourist draws from Pskov region.
And that's yet another extraordinary chapter which we didn't discuss, isn't it? About the director of Pushkin Hills, who in the 30s had been sent to the Gulag and had been, almost an opponent of the regime, and then eventually managed to scramble his way back and become appointed as the director. That's just another one of the extraordinary stories which we haven't managed to touch on that you can read in the book. So, is that a good moment?
Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, give a final show of appreciation to Howard.
Thank you so much, Howard and Tom. It was such an interesting discussion. And obviously we have plenty of copies of Russia Starts Here for sale downstairs, as well as Tom's book. I'm sure they'd be happy to sign some copies for you. Our bar will be open next door if you'd like to stay with us for a drink. And we'd also love to see you at the next Book Prize author events next week. So that will be on Tuesday the 10th. Sergei Radchenko will talk about his book, To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. And on Friday the 13th, there'll be a panel discussion with Arch Tate and Stephen DL, who are the translators of Alexei Navalny's Patriot. So that'll be a panel discussion about political prisoner literature under Putin. Thank you again for coming tonight. Hopefully we'll see you soon, and enjoy the rest of your evening.